welcome you all to another webinar series this academic year. And I'm very happy to host Dr. Hidayet Sıddıkoğlu today. So this academic year is actually 2 semesters. Webinar series will be devoted on migration in the world. So we are going to start with Iran as a case study, actually, and Afghans in particular. And then we are going to continue with the USA, with Spain, Lebanon and Jordan, Japan, Germany, Italy, India, and France. So you see in this webinar series, although we are staying put, we are going to travel around the world and see what is happening in other parts of the world. I mean, India, US, France, Iran, Lebanon, Jordan. So because during the last 2 years, we devoted our webinar series to what's been going on in Turkey, mostly, to different groups of migrants and to diaspora also. So, but this year we decided to expand our horizons a little bit more. So I'm very happy to host Dr. Sıddıkoğlu today. He hails originally from Afghanistan, but currently he is in Japan. And well, he's a world traveler. I mean, a world citizen, as we've been discussing before. And today we're going to focus on Iran and the Afghan situation there, because we know from Turkey, the Afghanistan, of course, is in turmoil. Taliban took over, and Turkey has been receiving lots of irregular migrants since 2019. In fact, I mean, it's not a new phenomenon, irregular migration from Afghanistan. In fact, Afghanistan displacement is not a new phenomenon. It's a very protracted situation. So we know also from case studies that most of the Afghans, at least under under international protection, and those irregular migrants also come from Iran. In fact, although Afghanistan and Turkey does not share a border, so through Iran and maybe Iran's policies, I mean, Turkey shares a de facto, a border, actually, perhaps a migration corridor between Afghanistan with Afghanistan. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Sıddıkoğlu. But before that, let's have Aysima a brief introduction of our scholar today. Thank you.
With pleasure. Thank you, Hocam. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you all to this academic year's webinar series, and I would like to introduce Dr. Hidayet Sıddıkoğlu very briefly. Dr. Sıddıkoğlu works as a director at Bilim, Organization for Research and Social Studies, which is a non-profit organization based in Kabul, Afghanistan. His main research interest is migration studies with a particular focus on conflict-induced displacement in Afghanistan. Dr. Sıddıkoğlu completed his PhD from Hiroshima University and has received his first master's degree in development science from the same university and a second degree in international security from the University of Leicester, United Kingdom. Today we are happy to host him and eager to listen to him, so I would like to give the floor to Dr. Sıddıkoğlu. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for a nice introduction, and Professor Akçapar, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk here about Afghanistan. I think I should share, because I prepared a slide, so I would like to share my slide if it's okay. Can you see my slides? Okay. Well, talking about Afghanistan, as all of us we know, Afghanistan has been threatened in the last 3 to 4 months, and we know whenever, for example, we hear about Afghanistan, it's not, by the way, from the last 3 months, over the last 4 decades, Afghanistan is tagged with the terms of war, conflict, humanitarian violation, and violation against women's rights, refugees, displacement, and narcotics. So even myself, born in Afghanistan, left the country in the age of 3, I had this perception of Afghanistan with all these identification. My perception of Afghanistan was a kind of a country, war-torn country, with a lot of problems, and particularly not for itself, but a problem for the world. I don't forget this, at the time, when I was in Istanbul, I met a friend of mine. He was there as a transit through Istanbul. He was assigned to work in Kabul, in European Union. We had coffee in a cafeteria somewhere in Taksim, and we were having a coffee and chat. I said to him that I have a wish or a dream to work for Afghanistan in the future. He said, you know what, wherever human beings live, there's always a place they throw unwanted items. So Afghanistan is a place a place of the world to throw unwanted items. So he meant to say it's garbage of the world. Nevertheless, my understanding of Afghanistan very changed at the time when I decided to go to the country and lived for a very long time. Approximately 3 years. I started living in Afghanistan from May 2019 to last August. So I left Afghanistan with last commercial flight leaving Afghanistan. The Afghanistan I'm going to picturize today would be not of course, I would be talking about some academic theoretical perspective of my migration, but at the same time, what I'm going to talk today would be a background of migration from theoretical perspective, but particularly when it comes to Afghanistan, I would like to give you a kind of a lecture where I want to give a good input of my own experience in it too. So really what Afghanistan really means for lots of people, because I've been giving lecture in Hiroshima University here also, the people's perception of Afghanistan remains the same. Unless for those who lived there for a long time, for people, it's looked like it's a desert without anything. Nevertheless, Afghanistan has a lot of beautiful places, and it's a lot of people, culture, a lot happening in a positive sense also in the country. So this is my content for today. I gave a brief, I have a brief background talk about migration, then I move on Afghanistan. I give you a brief introduction of Afghanistan, geographical situation, location, and then I will go talking about government structure and its ethnographic composition. Then I will move on refugees in Iran, and then I will talk a bit about the key challenges which we are facing at the moment with the Taliban control of the government or the country. Now, talking about the migration indeed, nowadays, it is a very big matter, but nevertheless, it's never been a matter of high politics or international relation during the Cold War, even before that. It just became a matter of high politics, or in other words, a matter of international politics only after the Cold War. During the Cold War, the matter of the huge matter in the international politics, international relation was a balance of power between the East and West bloc. So the world was dominated with Cold War politics. Nevertheless, Europe, since had to, during the Cold War, after the World War II, had to pay extensive price of war because of mass displacement. In Europe, it was particularly the case of migration was very different. For Europeans, after the World War II, migration was already a matter of higher politics. So it really formed the foreign policy relation with other nations, particularly given the mass influx of Germans, particularly Jews, during the Nazi atrocities in Germany. And because this was very important for Europe, in 1951, we came up with the Refugee Convention, was developed, and then later on, since a lot of developed or developing country or the former colonial countries started getting their independence and war we had in Eastern Bloc of the world, then we started having refugees all around the world, and then there was a protocol that was the convention. So it was the 1967 protocol has emerged. And then during the Cold War, in post-war era particularly, refugee studies or refugee issues become a multidimensional elastic concept, covering a large spectrum of social, political affairs, including international security and strategic studies. So everybody from different fields picked migration and discussed, for example, from economic perspective, from religious perspective, from social perspective, you name it. During this era in 1998, then we had more like traditionally perceived as a domestic issue, the matter of internal displaced people, or also we call it IDPs, also become a kind of international concern and regional concern. So there was a guiding principles of internal displaced people was also emerged as a key legal instrument for states to standardize the legal rights of internal displaced people. So even this instrument was all used by governmental and non-governmental organizations to deal with the internal displaced issues. In the last 2 decades, however, or 1 decade, the migration issue became again a very hot topic of the world politics, particularly in the West Bloc, especially since the takeover of Trump as a administration. I mean, like nationalism has become very important politics, internally or also externally. It became very important issue. And with saying that nationalism became an important issue, then the issue of migration became one of the security. So in other words, migration, name it regular or illegal, including regular, irregular, become as securitized as a cause for all ills of hosting societies. Nevertheless, of course, we have all these debates happening in a wide spectrum of debates, including academia and political debates. Nevertheless, if we see the real figures, also we can see that the migration really becomes very important issue, because now at the moment, a report by International Displacement Monitoring Center shows that there are 82.3 million people displaced globally in the world, and 48 million of them are IDPs, internally displaced. And most of these people live in the developing countries, or they're hosted in developing nations. And particularly the neighboring state host majority of these displaced populations. For example, Turkey at the moment is a leading country in terms of being home for the refugee population, particularly Syrians. In 2000, the reports of 2020 also says that the majority of these people uprooted or displaced, 40 million of these people are IDPs, and among them 9.8 million are in conflict-induced displaced population. Afghanistan, within this context, ranks the third refugee-producing country after Venezuela. I think the first is Syria, second is Venezuela, and third is Afghanistan. Indeed, for Afghanistan, refugee issue has never been an old issue. It has been an issue for over 4 decades. Forced displacement, therefore, has been a perennial crisis for the government to come up with a solution with. So there have been a lot of effort, not only with the government, but also its international counterparts, to come up with a kind of solution to end this refugee crisis. But nevertheless, so far they were not successful in terms of mitigating or providing a remedy for this crisis. Now, talking about Afghanistan, probably all of, or at least most of you know about the country, but let me explain where this country is located in order to just refresh your memory. Afghanistan is, as its political history is at large is ambiguous, it is geographical location is also somehow ambiguous, because according to North American scholars, particularly in the American foreign policy, Afghanistan used to be a Central Asian country. Nevertheless, in UN geographical classification, Afghanistan is a South Asian country. Based on my experience living in the country, when you see the culture and the people behavior, you cannot tell they are South Asian. At the same time, they are not very close to Soviet culture. So somehow in between these two blocks. So looking at the people's culture, it's more tended towards Central and Middle East rather than South Asia. It is northern neighbors from right to left is Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. In the west, it is neighbored with Iran. In the southeast, it is neighbored with Pakistan. In the east, it's neighbored with China. China, having the shortest border of 70 plus kilometers, is impossible due to its high-ranging mountains of over 5,000 meters from sea level. Nevertheless, Pakistan has the longest border with Afghanistan, over 2,500 kilometers. And Iran also has the second longest border of almost 1,000 kilometers with Afghanistan. It's 900 plus kilometers bordering Afghanistan's western borders. Now, in demographic-wise, the country is multi-ethnic country. It's comprised of multi-ethnic groups. Pashtuns form the majority, who traditionally they used to live in the southern regions of the country. Sorry, in eastern regions of the country. Tajiks are more in the northern regions and the central regions of the country. Then we have Hazaras. Hazaras are an ethnic group that they are historically Turks, but they speak Persian language or Tajik language, and they are located in the center of the country, most of them. Uzbeks and Turkmens are mostly dominated the northern regions because they are Uzbekistan or neighboring Turkmenistan. So that Central Asia is close. Geographic proximity with these countries also indicate that Turks mostly they live in the northern region. When we talk about migration displacement in Afghanistan during its peaceful time, also there were people moving out. If you see, normally we should have Pashtuns in east and southern regions of the country. This is traditional location for geography for Pashtun inhabitants. In the late 19th century, the King Amir Abdurrahman Khan, in order to make a centralized government, because in the whole history of Afghanistan, there was a political bargain between the center and periphery, because the country is multi-ethnic, and there was always, the center always had a doubt of peripheries of having independence. So that's why Amir Abdurrahman Khan was the first king that they started, bringing a huge demographic shift. What he did was he forced some Pashtuns to go to the north, and some Turkmen, because we have Turkmens in Herat. It's very strange. We shouldn't have them there. We do have Herati Turkmens and Turkmens in Helmand, because they were forced at that time to swap with people in Pashtun going to the north, Turks coming to the west. So this was done because the government in the center wanted to have a kind of country where they should not have, or the government wanted to have a kind of structure where they want to make sure that no periphery will go for a kind of autonomy in future. So this is ethnography of Afghanistan. Now, about state structure, political state structure, Afghanistan is governed under a centralized state institution that exercises power through three main departments: executive, led by the president, the legislature, and the judiciary. Legislation is bicameral. It has a House of People, which has 249 seats, and House of Elders, which has about 102 seats, and 1/3 of this House of Elders is appointed by the president. The president in Afghanistan is one of the centralized system. The president can say that has the absolute power. So one of the most centralized governing structure. The country has the most centralized governing structure in the world. The legal framework country is born of both Islamic and civil. However, traditionally, the customary law dominated by male have been widely practiced, which Taliban was also doing the same practice. Now, saying this, whatever I just said to you, this have been the structure of government till the last August 2021. Now, Taliban has captured, but they have a very different sort of governing system, and it's not yet clear what they are going to do. The only thing we are listening and we are hearing is that the Taliban vote to adopt King Muhammad Zahir Shah's constitutional law, which was monarchy. Now, we really don't know whether we will be left with this bicameral, with this with this three departments of governing institutions, like executive, will we have a parliament in the future? Will we have an independent judiciary body or not? What sort of government structure would be implemented in the future? That's a big question mark. So we will see what will happen. Talking about the history, why we have immigration or refugee become an issue in Afghanistan, we have to know a little bit of history in Afghanistan. The history, Afghanistan had its peaceful time during King Zahir Shah, who was appointed to become king in the age of 16 in 1933. The king had its kingdom for 40 years almost. In 1963, the King Zahir Shah brought a constitutional amendment, which Taliban was to adopt this constitution. This constitution provided at that time formation of independence, political independence for parties to form their political parties. And also there was a kind of freedom for press, and there was a parliament formed, judiciary was formed. And then nevertheless, the king, when he was in England for the treatment, his cousin, who served as the prime minister 2 times during his kingdom, set a coup d'etat, and in 1973 he grabbed the power and called himself the president of Afghanistan. And this was the time from which Afghanistan till today has gone through series of conflicts in different shapes. Once Dawood came, then people started in the peripheries, people started fighting against the Dawood's presidency, not accepting him as a president. Not only because of that, Dawood was indeed in the center of a debate at the time when he became president. There was a huge Cold War politics was going on in the region. So according to US foreign policy, he was called, or according to US politician, he was called Red Boy, because they considered him more of pro-Soviet politician or leader, president. Nevertheless, he himself tried best to remain not party to none of the bloc. He wanted to have non-alignment diplomacy. Nevertheless, because the country was small and it was very poor, by the time he couldn't survive without political aid and economic aid from each of the blocs. So because the US did not accept Dawood as a socialist or pro-Western, they pushed him because at that time Dawood was against Pakistan, and Pakistan was very close to US, so he was a bit pushed toward the Soviet, and then he had no choice other than shouldering or backing or supporting Soviet foreign diplomacy in the region. And then soon jihad started, and we had different parties forming in the country. We had the political party which he first founded was People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. This was divided into two: People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, Khalq, and Parcham. Then we had the Hazaras form their own political party, Tajiks formed their own. So these parties were not like any country's political party. They were at the same time their own military power. Soon before Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, there was small skirmishes between the government and all these parties started happening, particularly Islamic ones. And then 400 displacements were there recorded that people fled to Pakistan, and Pakistan was willing to host them at that time because they had their own political interest at that time. Nevertheless, then soon, 1979, Soviet invaded Afghanistan, and then we had boom. Over 6 million people were displaced, and majority of them fled to two major neighbors of Afghanistan, which was Iran and Pakistan. Now, the key timeline, if we divide, are very important phases in which migration happened. In 1979, Soviet invaded Afghanistan. We had over 6 to 7 million people displaced, and mostly in Pakistan and Iran. In Iran, I think, hosted over 3.5 million Afghans at that time. In 1989, it was Soviet withdrew from Afghanistan. Then we had a thing between the last Soviet-supported government, and there was a huge repatriation from Pakistan, Iran, almost nearly 3 million. And then again, soon after six months, we had another fighting started, which was a civil war between the factions, because there were 9 religious factions stationed in Iran and Pakistan. They came into Afghanistan. Each one claimed to have greater political power, and they started fighting because each of these factions were not political faction. They were not only political faction, they were military factions. So they started fighting, and there was fighting going on for about 2 more years. And then we had Taliban emerged as a religious political group, and they swept they swept the country across, and they almost 95% of the country came under the control in 1996. So during each phase of this, we had people migration, we had out migration and in migration, because war happened, huge mass people went to Iran and Pakistan. War stopped a bit, they came back. So this come and go were happening through all these major events. Then we had this 9/11 happen. US came in, and again we had influx of people going out, and soon after, and the Bonn agreement, we had this transition government in place, and again huge influx of people, repatriation of people started from Iran and Pakistan back to Afghanistan. And again, just a few months ago, we had this US withdrawal, Taliban capture of the country. Again, we have this huge influx of people going out of the country. And now there are thousands of them still waiting to go out of the country. Throughout all these events, what happens is, if you see the red, whatever I highlighted here in red font, is according to the records, over 75% of the people in Afghanistan somehow they experience displacement, forced displacement. Over 6 million globally Afghan refugees are there. Most of them are residing in Pakistan and Iran. Iran, I think at the moment has over 3 million Afghan refugees, and Pakistan nearly 2 million Afghan refugees. Afghanistan forms 1/5 of the world's protected refugees. And at the same time, Afghanistan itself is home for over 5 million internally displaced people. Now, talking about who cares about these refugees in Afghanistan? Afghanistan has, although refugee or displacement happened very early time, but nevertheless, government's response for refugee came very late. By means of that, the first institution responsible to handle refugee issues were established in 1986, and that was called Committee of Refugee and Repatriation. It is administrative level was administered by the Council of Ministers, and this was established during the former Soviet-backed regime. And the second changes in terms of this institution come in 1990, when the last government, after the Soviet withdrawal of the Afghanistan, since refugee people moving out of the country or internally displaced people become very huge. Every year they were expanding. Then the government decided to make it into a full-fledged ministry. So it became Ministry and Repatriation. However, when the in this state, as a refugee, Ministry of Refugee, when the Mujahideen, backed by international community, take over Afghanistan after a couple of the last Soviet government in 1992, up until 1996, when Taliban in their first rule in the country, they dissolve this ministry and make it small. It become Directorate of Refugee and Repatriation. It worked and administered under the Ministry of Martyr and Disabled Affairs. Nevertheless, after the installment of the government in post 9/11 by the US and international community, it again revived as the Ministry of Refugee and Repatriation. Presently also, the Taliban, surprisingly, this time they do not abolish the ministry because we have huge problem of refugee problems. They still keep it as a ministry, and now we do have it as a ministry in Afghanistan. Now, the org chart of the ministry is its legal or main function. It is the only institution, by the way, who is responsible to deal with refugee displacement or returning issues in the country. The Taliban's appointed Khalilur Rahman Haqqani from Haqqani Group as the Minister of Ministry of Refugee and Repatriation. Very important thing about Mr. Haqqani is this. I tried to put his photo without gun. I couldn't find most of the time because he carries his gun with him, even when he meets high-profile people, international, national. He always has his gun. I don't know. I hope he will, because people afraid of gun, they are become refugee because they don't want war. And I hope this man brings some sort of solution for refugee situations in Afghanistan. So he is currently the Ministry of Refugee, Mr. Khalilur Rahman Haqqani. And the ministry has the main three deputy who cares about financial affairs, refugee affairs, and policy and implementation. At the time when I was working in Afghanistan as a director of research and training need assessment in Afghanistan Civil Service Institute, I conducted the training need assessment of this ministry. At the time when I conducted with my team, we had data of their staff, which was about 1,247 staff. Afghanistan civil service system is they have a grade of 1 to 8, 1 to be top. So they have majority of these staff is work in the center, around 475, and the remaining they have institutions, directors in the provinces. So this is the sole ministry work responsible for implementing or taking care of refugees, internally displacement, and returning issues. Of course, not alone. There is a huge support of intergovernmental and non-governmental institutions, including government institutions like Norwegian Refugee Committee, Swedish Refugee Committee, and also UNHCR, IOM, International Organization for Migration. Where does the legal base of this refugee issues come from? The legal bases come from Constitution, some other international legal instrument. Although the refugee issue in Afghanistan has always remained a multi-layer complex issue, which has a multi-dimensional problems. And its protection has always been very difficult because the country has never had a peaceful time. However, since the Taliban takeover, according to IOM reports, the conflict has reduced almost 100%, 97%. We don't have conflict anymore. So let's hope for the best. At least if it is negative peace, let's hope for the peace to remain, and whatever government comes under the Taliban. So we hope that people do not displace anymore in the country. The bad thing about Afghanistan's law is that there's no refugee law so far. There's no national law, although Afghanistan is one of the leading countries in terms of producing refugees, but there's no national law of refugees. So all legal support of the ministry comes from the constitution, which is now subject to change. We don't know what will happen in future, because some articles like Article 6, 22, 38, and 40, they are make the basis of Afghanistan refugee policies, which says Afghanistan is a state of obligation that ensures equality among all ethnic groups and tribes. These are some of the provisions that forms the base of the ministry's legal foundation in terms of providing protection for displaced population. Also some civil and penal code. Nevertheless, these civil and penal codes are also subject to change, because we don't know what will happen in what will happen to the national constitution, because we yet to see what kind of constitution will Taliban develop or draft. So far, these were the laws mostly practiced to provide protection for the IDPs and refugees and returnees in Afghanistan. If we have to name it, it's statutes adopted by National Assembly were like law on citizenship, law on education, law on land and management, law on mass media, law on police, law on procedure and obtaining rights. These were the main statutes that they were used in order to provide protection for the displaced population. Also, some presidential decrees, definitely they are not going to be working under Taliban anymore, but still, so far they form the legal basis of protection. And also, Afghanistan, the good thing about the 2 decades of engagement, engagement means international engagement, Afghanistan was, I think, its ratification of international humanitarian rights. It's surprisingly, Afghanistan has ratified a chunk of humanitarian conventions. Afghanistan is party to guiding principles on internal displacement. It is party to Geneva Convention relating to protection of civilian persons at the time of war. It's also party to Refugee Convention 1951 and also its protocol. So you name it, Afghanistan is party to most of the humanitarian instruments, international legal instruments. So these also brings Afghanistan responsible in order to provide protection to refugees, IDPs, and returnees in the country. Now, alongside this, Afghanistan also had its international policies. For example, national policy on IDP was crafted by the help of international organizations such as UNHCR and UN Habitat, UNDP, and RC. So the whole of this IDP policy rests on the prevention of displacement, and also protection of during the displacement, durable solution. Nevertheless, although all of these policies, if you go through them, there are very good statements in it. There are very good legally written documents you come across. Nevertheless, none of them were so far implemented on ground. And also, Afghanistan had its national development frameworks, which was adopted by the government in 2020, and it has to come up. They had to put it in between 2021 and in this one also, although there was no explicitly anything about the refugee, but still overall it provided the protection to the people equally of those that are internally displaced or refugees or returnees. Nevertheless, as I said, all of these were important documents, but nevertheless did not implemented practically on ground. So refugee displacement issue in Afghanistan as of today remains one of the huge or one of the big complex issue for the state or for the government to tackle. Now, this was whole about Afghanistan. Let's talk about Iran, the biggest recipient of Afghan refugees. Iran is a country that has ethnic, religious, and cultural proximity with Afghanistan. The population if I give you a very big, short snapshot of the country in terms of demography, Iran has a population of 83.99 million, according to World Bank. Its population demography is composed of Persians, like forming 51%, Azeris 24%, Mazandaran, definitely they speak also Persian, so there are 8, Kurds 7, Lur, Baloch, and Turkmens are other minorities that live along the borders with the countries that they are origin ethnics from. For example, Turkmens normally live in the northern Khorasan, which is bordered with the Turkmenistan. So now people living in Herat of Afghanistan they have same dialect, Persian speaking dialect as of Iran. So all these ethnic proximity makes Iran a favorite destination for Afghans to go to Iran. In Iran, the institution that is responsible in tackling with refugee issues is called Bureau for Alien and Foreign Migrants Affairs, which works under Ministry of Interior. The org chart of this institution, it has a general director, which is stationed in Tehran. It has deputy director and directorate of department, which has administrative and protection directorate. It has administrative service centers in Tehran region, and also in each province, it has its branches. So it has finance, bay inspection, cultural communication departments. So, and they have recently started online services to all refugees, including Afghans, in terms of information sharing, in terms of providing some legal advices, and also in terms of applying for certain services, civil services. Now, talking about Iran's behavior or Iran's attitude toward Afghan refugees, Iran, frankly speaking, Iran did not have consistent diplomacy or policy toward Iran's diplomacy or policy towards Afghans, similar to that of Pakistan, remained hugely inconsistent and vulnerable, or in other words, it was influenced by regional and international politics, and also, of course, by internal politics, domestic politics of Iran also. So at the time of Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Iran was one of the best places for Afghans to move because they were welcome there. As soon as they entered to the country, they were given indefinite, they were accepted as refugees or provided safe haven in terms of they could live there, provided residency permits in prima facie policy under prima facie. So they had those who arrived at that time, they were automatically given the permit of residence, and they were called blue card holders. And this policy unfortunately changed in 1992 when the last government, Soviet-backed government, was toppled down and Afghanistan lurched into civil war. And on Iranian side, it was claimed that Afghanistan is no anymore a country under invasion. It is a civil war, and this is the Afghans' own responsibility to go and build their country. So there's no more rights for them to stay in Iran as a refugee. So they officially refused to register Afghans in 1997 and stopped granting any sort of permit of residence to Afghans. And Article 948 was established during this time that defined the parameters of forced deportation or deportation. It was based, the parameters of this, the Article 48 was based on the demonstration of valid documentation of the threat that proves the actual physical threat for Afghans who are living there. Now, talking about the, okay, sorry. In 2001, and at the same time, they started cutting the public services, including people who had registration cards. So this happened throughout the year. It wasn't solely because civil war was going on in Afghanistan. It was also happened due to international political changes in international politics. That's more like to say more it changed due to the fact that Iran's relation with West was also changing. Whenever there was a sanction against Iran, definitely it was going to backlash. It was going to have a negative influence on Afghans, refugees, not only Afghan refugees, or any refugees staying in Iran, including Iraqis. So all those rigid policies somehow were under influence of either Iran's bilateral relation with that country or under Iran's relation with Western nations, particularly its nuclear problems in terms with United States, with Israel, and also with Europe. So in 2001, what happened is once the transition government in Afghanistan was installed by international community, mass movement was happening. People were moving back from Iran to Afghanistan. So the borders for refugees was officially closed at that time. Now, during 2003 and 2007, there are huge events happened that made both inward and outward migration between Iran and Afghanistan. The important event happened during this time was that a new system was introduced in 2003 by Iran, which was called Amaish cards. That meant a registration of all Afghans, including those that they were given the permit of residence under the basis of 1990s, who came before 1990s and 1980s, that were given residence permit again under the prima facie diplomacy. They were also had to change the cards and register under the new card system, which was called Amaish card, or Amaish means preparation or logistic cards. So these cards provided a kind of, they were more of biometric cards that every Afghan had to take this, had to register in this. So does this card mean the Afghans were accepted as a refugee or not? This is another debate. In Iran, as a de facto, most of the people, particularly those who came to Iran or born in Iran, are called refugees, but it's remain again a very hard debate that for most of refugees, I mean, like for most of Iranians, they call it de facto, but at the same time they call them as a temporary guests, so they will leave back. So the few of them they are accepted in terms of real, they're given the real refugee status, that which ends up with a kind of naturalization or having providing for Afghans the opportunity to apply for Iranian citizenship. So these cards are always its legal status has always remained ambiguous. So they were vulnerable for the termination. These terminations were very simple, as it is that if a person who has the Amaish card could not renew it because they were maybe unable to pay the card's fee, which was about $200, or any other reason, they could lose their status of refugee. So it was such a vulnerable card, even today. In 2004, again, a new event came in terms of a new policy was implemented by Iranian government. So all Afghans, although they were allowed to go to school, but they came with a kind of policy that Afghans must provide the tuition fee for school, and it was not really cheap for Afghan refugees. They have to pay $150 a year, which seems to be cheap, but nevertheless, for people, for family who has families are 8 to 9 people, and in that circumstances, even $10 per month is quite a big money sometimes for such kind of economic situation. Now, all these, some academicians, some debates, some articles, some in some reports, there have been arguments that these changes by Iranian government, in a way, they have interpreted these changes as a soft or a kind of strategy to force Afghan refugees, no matter whether they have came to the country in 1980s or 90s, to force them for the deportation to go back. So according to some scholars, it's a kind of cheating that the Iranian government is doing on legal basis, changing these cards. And one thing important about these cards is the Amash cards are only 1 year extendable cards that every year they have to extend it. So now they have 16 barcode number cards. That's the latest one they have started now. So again, it's for 1 year. You have to provide taxes, which is I think around $200 plus the card fee. Somehow between $200 to $350 they have to pay in order to obtain this card. And later in 2004, and then there was another policy implementation regarding restriction of movement in Iran for Afghan refugees. So there were a lot of regions that they were designated no-go areas for Afghan refugees. So there are lots of Afghan refugees residing in these provinces for years had to move out within a given period of time. So some people could not make it or not aware of this restriction, were caught later, and they were deported, no matter if they were born there. So Iran had this kind of diplomacy, which has always been criticized by international scholars or by agencies that they work on refugee issues. Now, the later phase between 2008 and 2020, when Afghanistan hugely again started moving towards Iran, because in 2008, the skirmishes or violence between Taliban and this government or against US-led government or US forces in Afghanistan escalated. And this was hugely because the US strategy of drone, which provided a kind of political leverage or a kind of help, political assistance for Taliban to win hearts of people, because all those drone attacks in Afghanistan peripheries or in Pakistan, including Pakistan, had a collateral damage. So that when Taliban's politics in terms of winning people's heart, recruiting people against US for the revenge. So this escalation of conflict between Taliban and Afghan government forces, including foreign forces, led to conflicts. And again, a lot of people started being displaced internally and externally. Of course, this had impact also on Iran. So again, lots of influx of thousands of people were recorded going back to Iran. And then in Iran in 2008 and during 2008, I think there was a comprehensive regulation plan which registered all Afghan refugees and provided them a kind of temporary state permit, which required Afghans to, in order to get this temporary residence card, Afghans were forced to get passport and tazkira, which is Afghani ID card. Since acquiring tazkira and passport is also a very difficult procedure for Afghans, because in the first stage, Afghan embassy in Tehran did not provide tazkiras, and later they provided in Tehran and few provinces in Iran. Nevertheless, it was a very prolonged procedure in order to identify Afghans, provide them ID, then passport, then they were obliged. So most of because of all this very long bureaucratic procedure, most of the Afghans were not willing to get the cards. So most of the Afghans remained undocumented in the country. In 2012, Iran, because vote to expel about 1.6 million refugees. This was in response to Afghan government's strategic security pact, which was signed by the US and NATO forces. In order to protest this, Iran expelled about 1.6 million Afghan refugees from Iran. That meant deportation of about 200,000 refugees annually, which meant about 700 per day. Now, if we see the last phase of this movement which is happening right at the moment, is 2021. Well, I was there in Afghanistan when all these things were happening. To be honest, in 12th August, when Taliban very conquered or they managed to control most of the provinces, things in Kabul was very normal. And even on 12th, 10th, I went to my office and everybody was there. We were working as a normal city. I will show you a few photos of that. Nevertheless, Taliban gradually were taking control of all these provinces. It didn't happen in an overnight. Almost since 2011-12, when first America wanted to engage with Taliban politically, and 2012 when they opened political office in Qatar, Taliban were expanding their political and military power in the country. They gradually almost taken in 3 to 4 years most of the districts in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has about 350 districts, so they could get the control of over 100 districts in 2018 and 19. When I was there were almost half of, not half, almost 35 to 40% of the country was under Taliban control. And gradual increase of these always push people to go back to Iran. And these, because Iran has a very long border, about 1,000, and those areas, if you see here, most of them are places where people from Afghanistan gone cross. There are 3 official gates that for crossing for Afghans, for normal crossings, 4, sorry, and also this Rubat. But it doesn't mean that this whole border is indeed porous. They can go through any part Iran. Smugglers use not the real gates, they use any possible area for the intrusion. Also, Pakistan is also used as a main border to cross to Afghanistan through, for example, Taftan, and also very, not through gate, but there are lots of loopholes here that smugglers take Afghans across the border. According to recent reports by UNHCR, about 5,000 people are daily crossing to Iran nowadays. Recently, Iran official warned Afghans, I think 3 days ago, that they should not come. He warned that Afghans should not come to the gate or the border, to the borders of Iran, and they should avoid, because they are not going to accept any Afghan refugees in the country. One thing is very important. These are the main places that Afghans are living in the provinces. They're mostly in the northern or central Khorasan province, in Razavi Khorasan, and also their population is mass, or they live mostly in Iran because of its economic hub. There are a lot in Isfahan, Yazd, and some in Kermanshah, and also Fars. These are the provinces where Afghans normally reside. Most of the Afghans reside in urban areas. Very few of them, they are in the settlement area. Nevertheless, this is very important. I just wanted to share with you is, although there are lots of Afghans in Iran, there's huge repatriation also happening at the same time. If you see from 2016, almost 500,000 people are returning back. Particularly in 2020, there were nearly 1 million people returned back due to COVID-19. Even this year, from January, almost 1 million, almost 800,000 people has returned to Afghanistan. So it's not always like that people are going out, but at the same time, they're also coming back to Afghanistan. Now, talking about the challenges, how we can control this, Afghanistan has huge challenges. People do say that Taliban conquered the country, but Taliban did not conquer a country in economic prosper. At the moment, Afghanistan, with a population of 40 million, it is 37.6 million live under $2 earning per day. 30.5 million of it is in need of social assistance. Imagine almost 75% of the population is in need of social assistance. And 20 million are in acute humanitarian need. It's just huge for a country like that, like Afghanistan. At the same time, it's home for 5.5 million IDPs and over 3 million acutely affected by drought. there's acute challenges of health in health sector. Only 9.4 skilled doctor available for 10,000 people in Afghanistan. About 87% of women experience violence in the country, and 60% of them experience multiple form of violence in the country. 80% of the country at the moment is facing serious drought. 80% of the girls with disability don't go to school. Now, Taliban has the control of a country of this structure, this socio-economic situation. Even worse in this is since the Taliban control of the country, there's no cash, food prices are soaring. None of the public administrations are working in the last 1 month now, approximately 2 months. So people are in dire humanitarian need in the country. Now, we are, before asking Taliban or before talking about the official recognition of the country, countries in the total collapse in terms of humanitarian needs. So millions of people are in dire need of. One thing is very important to know is that Afghanistan's weather is very harsh in the winter, which is almost not even 1 month away from us. So, of course, there was recently G20 discussions in Afghanistan. They had this, the main topic of discussion was in Afghanistan. They plead to support over $1 billion for, but there is no mechanism how this money will be transferred for people in need. Nevertheless, if you see within the Taliban also, there is a huge problem of interpretation, how they would have a religio-political system when there is a diverse interpretation within Taliban itself. So they haven't come across, because this is very important thing that shows that Taliban is facing a kind of difficulty in terms of what kind of Islamic system which should govern, is because they haven't come across a kind of system that allows girls to go to school. So this mainly is due to the fact that people within Taliban have different perception of Islam, different perception of Islamic governing system. So these are some of the huge problems that Afghanistan is facing at the moment. Now, what could be the solutions? If we see, there are multi-layer problems and multi-dimensional problems in the country. Socio-economic intervention is in need. There is need of political intervention. There is need of institutional intervention. If someone needs to come up with a kind of intervention to solve some of the main problems. What I mean, and it should be done in 3 levels: subnational, national, regional, and global level. What I mean by socio-economic, through my own experience, in Afghanistan, there is no meaning of nation. People do not really know what nation is. There's not a kind of norm that is collectively accepted. Of course, there was going to be built in the last 20 years, but still not in a level that can bring all people together. There's no national artifacts and symbols that can keep people together and fight for that mean or struggle for that mean together. That's why they're all polarized. In terms of education, also social structures also fallen apart, although there were millions of investments there. Schools are there, but they're not the quality. Societal rules, regulations are not really the matter of international involvement in the last 2 decades. They never cared about these things. They just wanted to build a state without building the base. So economic investments, another thing, if for example, now is a golden opportunity in a sense that there's no war. There should be a kind of structure that allows a government to be accepted by the international community. And soon there should be economic investment, job creations, and forming formal economic migrations to the country that they need Afghan labor. This kind of engagement is very necessary in both national, regional, and international level. From the political perspective, there should be a regional political framework, particularly in receiving countries like Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey should have a kind of migration management or migration asylum or returning management pact, they should come across this kind of agreement that how can they regulate all these movements? Like they can look, for example, for Europe for this, because European Union is also creating this kind of management, refugee management framework. These three countries, since they have been working, they have been facing Afghan refugee is one of the most important topics, particularly in their foreign diplomacy, as well as it concerned their domestic politics. I think this kind of management could help these three countries to manage the migration, out-migration from Afghanistan in a better way. At the same time, international government can also be part of it. For example, the European Union, UNHCR, IOM, all these institutions can work together for a kind of a platform that is organized between these three countries. And also in political level, there should be a push on any rule, or for example, if Taliban is in the rule in the coming decades or coming years, they should be pushed for prioritizing refugee issues, for creating a holistic approach abreast with all national, international organizations to come up a kind of mechanism to handle this refugee. Because Afghanistan, at the moment, one of the biggest challenges of Afghanistan itself internally is its own internal displaced population. There should be a national law regarding to meeting up the refugee issues. In institutional level, I think, because I work in Afghanistan's institution, there's huge lack of capacity in public administration. There should be a capacity development program, particularly border management programs, how returnees, how refugees, displaced people should be managed. We need huge technical support from countries that they have better experience on this. Afghanistan should be provided all these capacity training programs. At the same time, there should be interaction tools we need. For example, there should be continuous interaction with the state, region, subnational and international level, accountability of the task that's happening, data sharing, national level, regional, international level. In cooperation, coordination, communication is something very important that should be picked or given importance in a very high level. That without cooperation, coordination with national, international organizations, it's never possible to handle refugee issues in Afghanistan, whether it is in Iran or Pakistan and Turkey. And this was all about my presentation or my lecture today. Let me give you a good visual tour of Afghanistan. You see on the left side is Afghanistan, a photo taken by a journalist that I took from installed from the online. This is the same hill. This is called the TV mountain. I also used to commute through this hill when I used to go to my office. I took same photo, almost a bit different angle, but look at the change. This is in 2002, which looks like a desert. Now it is a big development. It's physically, you can see the development. And now this is Panchayat Valley. You see how beautiful it is. The country is really nice in terms of green and water. You see the nature. This is Panchayat Valley, where still there's few skirmishes going on between Taliban and the alliance, Northern Alliance. This is, I took this photo on 12th August, 2 days before I left Kabul. Huge people at that time, because Taliban were fighting with the government and they were conquering or taking control of major cities, there were huge influx of people in Kabul. This is one of the parts in central city which was full of people. They had their tents. Look, this is I took just 2 days before I left. And this is some photos I took in the city. If you see in the city, people are in normal life or going on. So nothing was changed. Only in the banks, there was queue because there was no cash even 1 day, 2 days before. This is the institute where I worked for about more than 2 years as a director of research department and assessment. And this is the backyard of it. We had huge place of over 50,000 square kilometers. This was a basketball and sports ground for football, basketball. This is a dormitory for male participant who used to come for the training programs. This had a capacity of 100, and this is for female dormitory. It has a capacity of 50 people. This was our hall. This is all classrooms. And this is all by my side of the presentation or lecture today. Thank you very much for listening it.
Thank you, Hidayet. That was really amazing. You know, but it's also interesting to learn what's been going on, the different phases of out-migration from Afghanistan and all this repatriation, since, you know, almost it became like a circular migration, right? At
indeed,
least
indeed.
During some time periods. But of course, not all repatriation was voluntary. Some was involuntary, forced to repatriate. We need to underline that. And look at Iran's situation also, the change of policies towards Afghan refugees. And we know that Iran also used Afghan refugee young men also during the Syrian civil war to the Assad regime. You know, in return for promising, in return for citizenship, right?
Indeed.
It's never delivered.
Never delivered, yeah.
So a big, crisis, what can I say?
Yes,
okay, well, we can open some questions from the audience in Turkish or English, doesn't matter, because our, speaker is conversant in both. And probably many other languages too. Okay, sorularınızı alabiliriz lütfen varsa. Okay, o zaman hızlıca ben sorayım. So let me ask the first question.
Okay.
So, what I see you're also talking about, you're trying to bring up some solutions to the issue, like how Afghans should develop a national refugee law or a returning law, right? And the regional framework between Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey, for the irregular migrants probably, and refugee issues and repatriation, etc. A border management program, perhaps border, technical support, perhaps from the EU. I mean, if the EU countries decide to recognize the Taliban regime, of course, in due time. So yes, these are all good, but are you optimistic that the out-migration or this migration pressures from Afghanistan we'll see soon? What is your point? And how do you think this will affect Turkey?
Well, I don't think it is, because one of the main problem of Afghanistan at the moment in terms of migration is brain drain out. So if you see most of the people working in a high position, all of those talented are almost gone. One of the I think this is unfortunate for Afghanistan. I don't know how the government or the Taliban would lead the government or form a government unless they have human power. Yes. So one of the critical thing in Afghanistan at the moment, particularly in terms of women, none of those investments anymore exist in Afghanistan. I mean, physical is somehow you will do it, but those 20 years of capacitated human investment is all almost gone, and the remaining desperately waiting to obtain a passport and leave the country. And even though there was a criticism of the Taliban of saying that PIA or two airlines, Afghan, the private commercial airlines, Comair and Pakistan's national airline was the only airline operating between Kabul and Islamabad, providing route for people to go out, although they were selling the tickets 20,000 plus, probably $1,200 to $1,500 almost. Although it's an hour flight, there was a lot of critics by the people. But even people, when Taliban said ordered PIA and Comair to below the prices, bring them below the prices, it's normal level, which used to be about $100, $100 and $150. PIA just stopped. They say that this is an intrusion. We cannot do this anymore. So people started being desperate more, and they say that now they are in cage. So a lot of people are still waiting to come out. It's not a matter of security, if you see, Professor Akçapar. It's a matter of ideology. It's a matter of people do not want to live anymore, because we don't have a nation of 1996. We have a nation, we have a country where majority of the population, over 75%, is comprised of youngs of age 15 to 24, and most of them are somehow educated.
Yes.
And we are living in an era of globalization. We have internet, we have all these facilities, people are aware of international rights, there are freedom of expression, somehow even whatever they compress, but still they can use their smartphones and they have a lot of things happening. And this is forcing people to leave out. They do not accept oppression anymore. So this would be a big challenge. And I do think it's not going to, even government of Taliban is accepted by international community, huge number of people will leave the country just only because they do not fit ideologically with this regime.
Yeah. Yes, indeed, brain drain is a huge problem, and women's issues are another problem, and we are going to be affected, of course, Turkey. So I think there is someone raised a hand, but I can't see.
Professor?
Yes, please.
It's Mose Bigirman. I think
Hi, Mose. Yes, how are you? Please, ask your question.
Yes, I had to, but I think I'll start by, the first question, then later I can ask the second. My question is, basing myself on the history of the Taliban and the way they went on power, the help which they got from Pakistan. Will I be wrong if I say that Pakistan is the one leading Afghanistan right now?
Did you hear well? I couldn't hear well, but I couldn't. The question was, do you think Pakistan is leading, in a way, controlling Afghanistan now?
To me, the history of the Taliban, to me, the Pashtun, the way they are.
That's a valid point.
I got the question. I got the question. Okay. Any other question? You had second question also.
Later. Can you give me the answer?
Okay, later. Okay, yes. Let me quickly answer this. Shall I answer now?
Okay, maybe we can ask Volkan also. He has also a question.
Okay.
Türkçe konuşacağım eğer müsaade ederseniz.
Tamam.
Buyurun efendim.
Bu kadar kapsamlı bir sunumu ilk defa gördüm. Teşekkür ederim özellikle Afganistan hakkında. Çok mükemmel bir sunumdu cidden. Benim sorum şuna yönelik. İran'da, gerek Afganistan'da, gerek İran'da, gerek Irak'ta, bölgedeki tüm göç veren ülkelerde gördüğümüz temel aslında unsur şu. Etnik kompozisyon çok karışık. Yani temelde bir ulus devlet olma bilincini yaşayamamış devletler bunlar. Sizce Taliban şu an edindiği ideolojik unsuru kullanarak ileride Afganistan'da kuracağı bir milli birlikle ya da işte dini birlikle, artık neyse her ideolojisi kendilerinin, bunu sağlayarak Afganistan'dan göç çıkmasını engelleyebilir mi? Ne düşünüyorsunuz bu konu hakkında?
Ya, soruyu alalım mı yoksa devam edelim?
Başka soru varsa bir tane daha soru alabiliriz. Hepsine birden yanıtlar hocamız. Ben de mesajları okuyorum. Teşekkür ediyorlar size hocam. Bu güzel sunum için. Çok kapsamlıydı gerçekten. Hem demografik açıdan, etnik açıdan hem de siyasi açıdan. Tabii ki yazabilirsiniz bağlantılı bir soruysa Taha lütfen. Yazmak isteyenler var. Sizinle irtibata geçmek isteyenler var. Eğer irtibat e-mailinizi paylaşmak isterseniz gruba chatten yazabilirsiniz sonra Hidayet Hocam.
Olur.
Okey. Atata bekliyoruz sorunu lütfen. Okey. İsterseniz okey.
Başlayayım mı? Soru mu gelecek?
Siz başlayın. Soru gelecek ama sonra yönel.
Okay.
Sağ olun.
Now, starting the first question about Pakistan controlling Taliban, rather Afghanistan, I would say influence of Pakistan rather than saying control of Pakistan. Pakistan it is a big debate in academia as well as in political debates that Pakistan does have a lot of influence on Taliban, which is true, but it doesn't mean that they control totally Taliban. Well, same as Iran has some sort of leverage in Afghanistan's politics, because these two countries are the countries they left the most biggest, I mean, the major footprints in Afghanistan comparing to any other neighboring countries or international community. So definitely they do have a strong influence on Taliban, or coming whatsoever political power comes to take the rule of Afghanistan. They definitely will have their influence on it. In terms of Pakistan, Pakistan did have very strong relation with the Taliban. Nevertheless, nowadays we are seeing a lot of tension within the Pakistan, because after Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan, the Tehrik-e-Taliban of Pakistan also started becoming very active, conducting suicidal attacks against the government. So this raises the concern in Pakistan that will this allow or make some sort of influence to the hardliners within Pakistan to come up and to be because they were the headaches for a very long period of time. They fought with they were as close as they could conquer or control a madrasa, which was right in the very close to the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. So it is indeed radicalism, religious extremism is one of the major problem of Pakistan, particularly Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. I don't think they have the control over Pakistan, but they definitely have deep influence on them. And recently, one of the Taliban's key figures has expressed that they do not accept the border as international border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And this has been one of the longest issue, one of the main key issue between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which led Pakistan to always support any anti-government entity, just only because any government that comes to rule Afghanistan never accepted the border. They call it Durand line rather than calling it international border. And this creates a kind of very sensitive sentiments in Pakistan leadership. And then again, they find some sort of entity to balance their power against the state. So I don't think in that way Pakistan controls Taliban, not at all. And about Volkan's, bunu Türkçe mi söyleyeyim, İngilizce mi söyleyeyim?
Türkçe söyleyin hocam lütfen.
Bu genellikle tabii ki etnik çoğunluklu ülkelerde böyle sorunla karşı karşıya, doğru diyorsunuz. Mesela Suriye olsun, Irak olsun. Etnik çoğunluklu, yani böyle bir nasyonalizm dediğimiz milletçilik bu duygusu olmayan ülkelerde genellikle bir savaş çıktığı zaman da böyle polarization, yani bu göçe sebep olabiliyor. Fakat Taliban'ın elinde geçen şu anki çok nadir bir var, fırsat var ki hiçbir zaman, yani yüzüyle baktığımız zaman da böyle bir fırsat gelmemiştir Afganistan tarihinde. Çünkü %100 oranda bir savaş yokluğunu yaşıyoruz. Savaş yok ülkede şu an. Bu ne demektir? Ama şu da biraz kaygı duyucu. Çünkü kurulan kurgu da baktığımız zaman, bu strüktüre baktığımız, hükümet strüktürüne baktığımız zaman 30 kişinin içinde yalnız 4 kişi etnik şeyini temsil ediyor. Bir tane Türklerden bir Özbek var. Taciklerden 2 kişi var. Peştunlardan yaklaşık 26 kişi var. Halbuki etnik kompozisyona baktığınız zaman da %42'si Peştun. Bu ne demektir? %50'den aşağı Peştun olması gerekiyordu. Tabii buna ne kadar Talibanlar izin verecek ileriki zamanda, bu hepimizin bakıp görmemiz gerektiren bir şey. Bence bunun üzerinde de yakında, şu anda herhalde Taliban'ın Dışişleri Bakanlığı şu anda Türkiye'de diye biliyorum ben. Elbette bu konu üzerinde de tartışılıyor. Genellikle Pakistan, Türkiye ve Özbekistan daha çok vurgusu var ki böyle bir strüktür, hükümet yapısı olsun ki etnik grupları da içeriye, yani en azından o istediği şekilde olmazsa bile yani %50 bir hak verilsin ki bir başlangıç olsun, bir ülke teması olsun. Eğer bunu başarabilirsek dediğiniz gerçekten olabilir. Çünkü acayip millet yorulmuş durumda. Kimse savaş istemiyor. İnanın yani genelde bizim barıştan tarif ettiğimiz şey, Türkiye'de birisine gidip mesela Avrupa'da ya da Batı ülkesinde ya da Japonya'da buradayken ben peace dediğimiz zaman, barış nedir dediğimiz zaman burada sosyal hizmetlerden bahseder insanlar. Sosyal hizmetler olmazsa barış yok derler. Ama Afganistan'da sosyal hizmetler lüks hayat demektir. Yani oradaki barışın işte anlamı savaş yok demek. Ölüm yoksa barış demektir. Çok güzel bir hayat demektir. Ama barışın tarifi ülkelerde böyle değil. O yüzden gerçekten millet çok yorulmuş durumda. Bunun çok altın bir fırsat diye biliyorum ben. Ama ne yazık ki bak görmemiz lazım. Çünkü Taliban dediğimiz tek bir örgüt değil esasında. 4-5 onun altında olan subgrup dediğimiz en azından 3 grup var. Bu üçün bir ikisi de bu İslami algısı, İslam nasıl bir devlet kurgu algısı çok farklı grubun içinde. Eğer bunu birleştirebilirse bir ittifak içerisinde mesela Katar geçen de kendi ülkelerinin struktürünü örnek olarak almasını istedi ama Türkiye'de olabilir, Malezya olabilir, Endonezya olabilir. Bilmiyoruz. Bunu bak görmemiz lazım. Eğer bu fırsat kaçarsa ben gelecek 100 sene içinde daha böyle bir fırsat gelmeyeceğini inanıyorum aslında. Teşekkür ederim.
Hocam, ben de bu konuyla ilgili sormak istiyordum. Şimdi Taliban da kendi içinde bir sürü alt gruptan oluşuyor. Bunların olası çatışmaya girmesi tekrar bir savaş döngüsü başlatmayacak mı? O zaman tekrar mülteci akımları ve tetiklemesi ihtimali...
Tabii bir ihtimal olduğu için herkesin korkusu bu. Herkes işte Pakistan, şimdi şöyle bir şey, mülteci dediğimiz zaman Pakistan, İran'ın şeyi bu. Yani mültecide sharing diye bir olay var. Eğer sharing oluyorsa tamamdır. Çünkü geliyorsunuz bir ülkeye, siz giriyorsunuz, savaş açıyorsunuz. 20 senedir oradasınız ama mülteci konusuna gelince neden çoğunu Pakistan'la İran çeksin ki? Böyle bir şey de var. Argüman da var. Gerçekten böyle bir savaşın girilmesinden en çok korkan ülkelerden ikisi en azından Pakistan ve İran. Yani burada böyle bir savaşın çıkması ihtimali yok değil. En azından benim bakış açımdan %30-40'dan daha fazla. Çünkü Hakkani çok Taliban içerisinde en güçlü olan örgüt ve Hakkani grubun din algısı daha sert. Katar'da olan grubun İslam algısı biraz daha yumuşak. Yani bunların bir ara gelmemesinin yani bu İslam üzerinden bir hükümet kurabilmemesi 1,5 aydan beri kendi içlerinde başlatılan bu tartışma misali olabilir. Çünkü bunlar daha kız çocuklarına nasıl bir eğitim sistemini getirmek konusunda hiç ortak bir şeyleri yok. Belli ki Hakkani grup istemiyor. Hakkani grubun şeyine göre kız çocukları ilkokuldan sonra okula gitmemesi gerekir. Sadece eğer gidiyorsa bile doktor yani hastanede çalışabilecek kadar eğer şeyimiz varsa istemiyoruz diyorlar. Mesela öyle saçma sapan şeyler. Ama bunun ne kadar çözülebilecek şeyi İran, Türkiye dış yani bölgesel güçler ve ne kadar Taliban üzerinde etkisi olduğunu, olup olmadığını gösteren ileride göreceğiz bunu daha doğrusu. Bakalım bu ülkeler ne kadar bunu bastırabilecek ki, ne kadar Taliban bunu kabul edebilecek ya da en azından ellerinden geliyor bu iş yapmak. Yani bunu yapabilecekler. Eğer yapılmazsa tabii ki iç savaş demektir.
Evet. Okey, bir başka soru da Atataha'dan gelmiş. Aslında biraz önce buna da değindiniz. Şimdi 20 yıllık Amerikan işgali sonrasında Taliban'ın eskiden verdiği sözleri tutmaması, değil mi? Tutmamıştı daha önceki dönemde, 2001 öncesi gibi yine insan hakları, kadın hakları, eğitim, kültür gibi konularda benzeri bir tablo bizleri mi bekliyor? Yoksa Taliban radikal yönelimlerini gerçekten törpüleme yönünde inandırıcı adımlar atıyor mu, atacak mı diye sormuş. Bir kısmen buna yanıt verdiniz aslında. Yani değil mi, biraz muğlak bir durum var çünkü Taliban da tek bir grup değil, onu dediniz. Kendi arasında ayrılmış. Aslında tabii bütün Taliban aslında Peştunlardan mı oluşuyor?
Aslında öyle bir şey değil. Çok enteresan olan şey kuzeyde, mesela Akçe, Şibirgan dediğimiz Mezar-ı Şerif'in yanındaki olan ilde Taliban'ın çoğunluğunu Türkler oluşturur. Mesela Türkistan dediğimiz belgelerde bir sürü en önde gelen Taliban içinde komutanların çoğu Özbek ya da Türkmenden oluşan gruplardandır. Fakat bunlar alt kademada olan, yani şey olarak üst makamlara gelmeyen makamlarda çalışan, genelde Özbekler, Türkmenleri militan olarak görüyoruz, savaşçı olarak görüyoruz şeyde. Ama sizin de dediğiniz gibi sorun şurada. Acaba bu Taliban çatı altında birleşen 3 grubun hangisi daha çok güçlü? Korkutan şu, Hakkani grup daha güçlü. Yani elit force dediğimiz, Badri force dediğimiz Badri gücün sahibi ya da bu Bedri gücü öne süren, istihbaratı öne süren Hakkani grup. Ve Hakkani grup da en katı grup. Yani İslami dinci, bu bizim istediğimiz ya da ne bileyim insan hakları, buna pek çok bununla örtüşmeyen bir grup olduğu için Kuvvet Aşura dediğimiz bu grubun banisi Ömer, Molla Ömer'in oğlu Molla Yakup'un öne sürdüğü Kuvvet Aşura ve Katar Şurası, mesela diplomatik, yani Amerika Batı ile görüşmekte olan siyasi grup Katar grubu ile Kuvvet Aşura, bunlar biraz daha yumuşak. Bunlar biraz daha, mesela Al-Kaide ile fasilesi biraz uzaktan ve bunlar daha çok hani demokratik demeyelim de daha çok uluslararası camiasıyla bir uzlaşıma gelmek isteyen iki gruptur. Ama ne yazık ki öbür taraf Hakkani grup, en güçlü olanı da tabii ki Hakkani grubun da Al-Kaide ile kan bağı olan bir grup diye tanıyoruz. Ve o grup daha güçlü olan bir grup. Onu ne kadar etki altına alabilirler, ne kadar değişebilir? Hepimiz için bir soru işareti.
Tabii, yani gerçekten burada hem kendi aralarındaki bölünmeler, Taliban içindeki, hem diğer gruplar, değil mi? Hem uluslararası camia, hani hem bölgesel, belki Katar'ı da içine alacağımız Türkiye, İran, Pakistan gibi güçler. Yani çok karmaşık. Bunun üstüne aslında bir de biraz da aşiret kültüründen de bahsetmek gerekir. Öyle değil mi? Aşiretler,
gerçekten.
dinler. Yani sadece etnik olarak ayrım değil, hem de aynı zamanda aşiretlerin de çok güçlü olduğu, o kültürün de güçlü olduğu ve biraz da bölünmelerin bunun aşiretler ekseninde de yer aldığını biliyoruz. Yani gerçekten çok çetrefilli, biraz da geleceği hani hani büyük küreye bakıp görmek de çok zor olan bir dönemden geçiyoruz. Gerçi Taliban liderlerinin temsilcileri Ankara'daydılar biliyorsunuz geçtiğimiz gün.
Evet.
Dolayısıyla bir takım konuşmalar da yapıldı. İnşallah onların ülkesi için de faydalı olmuştur bu konuşmalar. Volkan'ın bir sorusu daha var. Onu da alıp kapatalım isterseniz. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you for the presentation again. I wondered that maybe I missed in your presentation, but could you give a brief information about labor market in Afghanistan, especially what the prominent sector in Afghan economy and what Afghani people do for a living in their life?
Okay. Afghanistan's economy relies mostly on agriculture, and it's over 60% relies on export of agriculture, particularly dry fruit. You name it, from almond, from raisin, all those stuff, and also fresh fruit to the neighboring countries such as Iran and Pakistan. Nevertheless, as I said in my presentation today, Afghanistan is facing a serious drought. Of 80% of the country is facing drought. This is not because only due to the natural climate change. This is because country has been in the conflict in the last 4 decades. There was never been a holistic approach or irrigation system for arable lands. Afghanistan's water, I think, is enough for itself because it's highly mountainous. It has a lot of glacial reservation, but nevertheless, since there's no good irrigation system, all waters go to the neighboring countries. We do have this water politics between Afghanistan and Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is also another topic that needs to be we need to have a different session probably on these kind of topics, because these can be also some of the main reasons why these countries have been trying to have their footprints in Afghanistan, because any regime that takes over in the country, they want to make sure that these water keep flowing in these countries, because these water coming from Afghanistan really provides water needs of the country of huge area, or in Iran and also in Pakistan. So we don't have an industrial country, but nevertheless, in the last 2 years, in 20 years, there were lots of small factories, small businesses that they were established. Unfortunately, most of them are closed. Unfortunately, most of the people who are running these businesses are already fled the country, or in the struggle to leave the country, to flee the country. So this is unfortunate for the people of Afghanistan. And also I said that there are few things happening there in terms of high tech or education, or all bringing all those brains in Afghanistan. Most of them are already left. So we cannot think of any private sector improvement in Afghanistan with this sort of regime unless we call back those people in the country.
Yes, that's another issue, indeed, very demanding, pressing issue, in fact. So one last question from Julie. Julie, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Please pose your question.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Sıddıkoğlu. I will try to ask you a question. Just ask me if you don't understand anything. So you are mentioning that Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan, they must have some management or agreement so that they can, you know, kind of regulate these movements happening in the region. And you're also mentioning the importance of regional cooperation and coordination. But some might argue that, for example, it is in Pakistan's advantage that Afghanistan remains weak and unregulated. Especially, they will not prefer a Pashtun-dominated government, as Pakistan also has the rebellious Pashtun minority, and many other reasons, actually. So do you think it is realistic that these countries will be willing to work into stabilizing the situation? And if that's the case, who will start such initiative?
Well, I really think it's a realistic and it is very pragmatic way of coming out of this problem, because I don't think Pakistan really frightens or wants a country which is weak in Afghanistan and keeps hosting millions of refugees for a long time comes in future. I mean, they really don't want to have that. They really want to have a country that is stable. What Pakistan concerns, what makes Pakistan to be concerned of a lot is the Indian influence in Afghanistan. As far as Afghanistan provides a kind of satisfaction for the government in Pakistan, or for Pakistan, that there is nothing intrusion, that no one is going to use its soil against Pakistan, including India, particularly India, I think they can have a very good neighborhood. Afghanistan is not the only single landlocked country which is bordering two enemies. Nepal, for example, bordering two enemies like China and India. They're still having they are weak, they're small, but they're prosperous. At least they're safe, and they have their government there, and they are practicing their own way of governance. This can happen in this region of the country also. And Pakistan, particularly under Imran Khan, has really moved toward very pragmatic. And I think 40 years of lessons is a lot more lessons for Pakistan to come up with a kind of new ways. They are willing to do it. And why not? If anybody wants to start with this kind of initiation, is these three countries. As far as we know, Turkey and Pakistan has a very strong cordial political relation, historic relation. They can start it. And Iran, of course, they can convince through, because once you have a common problem, it's always easier to come up with a kind of solution. We know that refugee crisis in 2014, 15, and 16 was a kind of catastrophic for Europe, and it was in the brinks of collapse because of refugee issues, although it was very small, but they come up with a kind of framework, a new framework to bring this as a union. These three countries has a common problem of Afghan refugee. Why not to bring a kind of a solution for this? If Turkey needs someone like a very good shepherd from Afghanistan, they should come through a legal way, right? If Pakistan needs cheap labor from Afghanistan, they can have it both way or another. But there should be a mechanism for this. It's not like the one which is happening at the moment. And it's, I think, much more pragmatic. We do have a lot of examples as such.
Yeah. Well, great. You still have hope, and we are also hopeful, Hidayet.
We must be. You're most welcome.
We must stay hopeful. Thank you again
Thank you.
for today, and we'll see you again next month, actually on the 12th November, with another webinar. And this time we're going to focus on Afghan refugee women in the US. Thank you,
That's great.
Hidayet. I'll see
Thank you very much.